Pray that the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every one of our hearts here today will please God, who is the one who loves us, who is our eternal rock, and our Redeemer. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most abused words in the English language, love. There are many aspects of love which we could talk about. We could talk about God's commands regarding love. We could talk about ways to love each other. We could talk about ways to love God. We could talk about what love isn't, or how love is portrayed by the media or by books, or different kinds of love and the different names that we give them. But this is the Christmas season. It's Advent. And today, we're not going to talk about our love at all. We're going to talk about God's love for us. And more specifically, what it is that can come between us and God's love. Did you know that something could come between us and God's love? Were you aware of that? Were you listening to today's passage? Let's take a closer look at it and find out. The first thing that it says in Romans chapter 8 about love is that we know that all things work together for the good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose. Yet we said, this is a very familiar passage, but we said that we're not going to talk about our love, and so we're going to skip right past this one. We'll come back to it in a few minutes, but we're going to look at the other statements in Romans chapter 8. The next statement comes in the form of a question, and the answer is implied in Romans 8:35, says this: who will separate us from the love of Christ? And then it goes on to list this list of things as a question. Will any of these things separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship? Will distress or persecution? Will famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As I said, this is a rhetorical question, so it's not actually directly answered, but the answer is very clearly implied that none of these things will separate us from the love of Christ. And I want to take a second and look at each of these and examine why Paul mentions them. He says, will hardship separate us from the love of Christ? What do we mean by hardship? Failing an exam at school? Heartache? The company moves, and we've got to make a decision to move with them, to leave our family. Do we blame these things on God and let that come between us and His love? Paul says hardship cannot or will not come between us and God's love. And next he says distress. Too many hours at work. The kids aren't cooperating. Family feuding, that's a fun game show to watch. But the family feud is not a fun thing to do within the family. Distress can keep us from our regular daily devotions, our time with God. So, can distress come between us and God? In fact, I think Paul's right. I think that oftentimes it has the opposite effect. When we're under stress, a lot of times we cling to God, or we turn to God, and we come to our knees and say, God, help us. What about persecution? Have you ever experienced persecution? Has anyone ever mistreated you because of who you are? Persecution is an attack on you, verbal, physical, because of your identity, your race, your gender, your social status, or your religious belief. Will you get mad that God made you the way that God made you? I certainly hope not. How about famine? Will famine come between us and God's love for us? Famine basically equates to a social situation, a social poverty, where the entire society has entered into a time where they can't get the things that they need to survive. The crops in the old time, when they failed, the society went into famine. Does the growing unemployment rate worry you? Do fluctuating gas and oil prices have you concerned? Does the cost of health care keep you up at night? These things may concern us, but do they separate us from God's love? And again, I think that Paul's right. We often do the opposite. They remind us that we have always been and always will be dependent upon God. Remind us of this truth that we often neglect when in better times or better times. How about nakedness is the next thing that Paul mentions, and by this we move from a social poverty to an individual poverty. Everybody else is doing well, but for one reason or another, we don't have the clothes we need to cover our backs. It's hit home. We've lost our job. The money is running short. Christmas is not only going to be lean, but we aren't even sure that we're going to be in this house come Christmas. Does this fear come between you and your relationship with God? Or does it draw you closer? For people who don't know and love God, each of these challenging situations has the potential to drive a wedge between them and God. They say, God, why are you letting this bad thing happen to our society? Or why are you letting this bad thing happen to me? And so they allow it to drive a wedge between them and God's love. But for those of us who trust God, it should weld us ever more firmly to Him, because He's the only thing that's going to help us through it. But Paul goes on. What about peril? What if your life is in danger? You're in the bad part of town, or the bad part of the world. You are being robbed at gunpoint. There's an old army saying that says, there are no atheists where? In foxholes. Why is that? Because bullets are flying overhead. Everybody prays. Everybody prays when the bullets are flying. So I think that Paul's right. When we are in peril, it doesn't drive a wedge between us and God. But what about the sword? What does he mean here by sword? Peril means in danger of dying. The sword means death is a certainty. That's the difference. Our life is in danger. Our life is forfeit. You've just been diagnosed. We've heard 2 diagnoses this morning about a terminal disease. The bullets have stopped flying overhead, and 1 or 2 of them have found their mark. You're laying there on the field. You're laying there in the hospital bed. You're sitting there at home. How does this affect your prayer life? My hope is that in the midst of this, our prayer will change from God save me to God save me. From God save me from this situation to God save me to your home. That our faith in eternal salvation will come to the forefront of our minds. I had a sword experience this week that I wanted to share with you. What day was that? Sarah, are you back there?
Yeah.
What day was that? And I woke up.
Wednesday morning?
Was it Wednesday? Yes, it was, because that was Wednesday. Wednesday morning, I woke up. It was just about right around 6 o'clock, and I couldn't get back to sleep. I had slept fitfully all night, and I'd been feeling stressed for the last several weeks, maybe months even, and so I was feeling kind of nauseous. I went to the bathroom, and I was sitting there, and our bathroom doesn't have heat. So you have to realize, like, when you're sitting there, you see your breath, okay? And I was sitting there, and feeling nauseous, and suddenly I felt some cramps over here on the left side of my chest. And I thought, that's not good. And then all of a sudden, I don't know if it was a heat flash or hot flash or whatever you call them, but my body got very hot, and I started to sweat all over. And I thought, oh, this is not good at all. I'm feeling nauseous. I'm feeling cramps on the left side of my chest. I'm sweating, and I'm seeing my breath. You know, this is not good. And I'm thinking to myself, should I call Tara? Should I try to wake her up and tell her to, you know, call an ambulance? You know, what's going on here? And I prayed. And do you know what I prayed? Very interesting. It's very telling when you're in the face of what you think might be your last hours, or, you know, a very serious condition at least. Examine your prayer and find out where your heart is. You want to know what I prayed? I said 2 words to God. That I'm sorry. Because as I was sitting there thinking about my life, I thought about how many times I had failed Him. How many ways I had fallen short of His expectations. How many more things I could have done. How many more people I could have witnessed. How much more love for Christ I could have shared. And the only thing